Anushka, look, because we kind of knew this was coming, we almost sort of discounted, I think, what a remarkable turnaround it was. I mean, I'm trying to think of any modern parallel from a party going from 20 points behind in the polls to a fairly, convincing, if not huge, win. I mean, it's just an incredible turnaround in a very short period of time. The Conservative leader actually lost his seat, having looked absolutely nailed on to be Prime Minister only a few short weeks ago. It's all down to Donald Trump. Pretty much everyone accepts that. I'm interested to know what you think the impact on us is or isn't.
Well, I think in terms of the speed at which things changed, as well as showing you that the reality changed, which was Donald Trump totally changed the way people in Canada was feeling, it also just again shows you how volatile politics is and how quickly things can change. I think we've spoken before about the fact that our chief of staff in Downing Street, Morgan McSweeney, was obsessing in the last election about other elections where things like this happened. For example, I think the Australian Labour Party in 2019 in Australia had led all the way up to the polls and then was pipped at the end, although it wasn't as big a change in actual polling as this. So first of all, it teaches us that volatility is everywhere, and however big, I think we know this, Labour have won in the past in this country in 2024, it doesn't really mean that much for the future. But the other thing I think it means is, Donald Trump is changing not just the way that Americans view the world, it's changing the way people view the world, the world over, and particularly in Canada. There is this sense at the moment we have an age of insecurity, where there are different factors that are making voters feel very insecure. And many would argue that was one of the reasons that Donald Trump won his second term. People in America were feeling particularly insecure because of prices, for example. Inflation had gone through the roof. Well, in Canada, they're feeling insecure because of America. I've got some polling that we're going to show on the Peston programme that shows when you ask people whether you think America is a force for good on global affairs or not, the Canadian view is bottom of the list. Absolutely do not think that America is a good force on global affairs. On top of that, Americans genuinely believe Donald Trump is serious about trying to make Canada an outpost of the USA. So in that moment of insecurity for Canadians, I think Mark Carney came in with a very simple answer to their insecurity, which is, I'm going to take on Donald Trump. I think the reality of governing and showing that you are actually going to be on the side of people and make their lives better is a lot harder. But it does show how dramatic a particularly clear and concise campaign message can be.
You spent quite a lot of your life studying economics. Mark Carney's talked a very good game about standing up to Trump. When you look at the Canadian economy as well as its politics, how able do you think he's actually going to be able to do that in reality?
Well, in a way, it's so difficult because it's very easy to say, and I think, again, we have this here in the UK, very easy to say you're going to stand up to Donald Trump. The reality is that, just the changes he's made on tariffs, the instability that he has caused has created huge kind of economic wobbles the world over. And few countries are more dependent on their relationship with America than the Canadians. So it's all very good for Mark Carney to be able to make that argument. I think it's a difficult one to actually put into practice, although I have heard Canadians saying that actually Mark Carney, who wouldn't have been an obvious leader in many ways, they see him as coming at the right time because they feel like right now they do need an economist to try and stabilize things and try and help them. I think all the economics and the politics is interlinked, isn't it? And the question is, can you stand up to Trump? And is there a way in which a Canadian leader can behave that makes Donald Trump less likely to be as aggressive towards Canada? And what I think the Canadian people have said is what they want is somebody who will also play the strong man and who will also, not hold back on these things. And perhaps that's the person who's going to best deal with Trump. I don't think that changes the underlying factor, which is they don't want to be in a trade war with the US because it would be devastating for their economy.
As you say, the Canadians do seem to have taken a decision. They want a strong man who's going to stand up to Trump. I think it's pretty hard to make the argument that that's what Keir Starmer is doing. He's obviously quite obvious. He's obviously decided, as we've discussed before, that he's going to take a sort of more diplomatic, maybe a more emollient approach. But it does strike me, really, when you think about it, our king is King of Canada. We have a historically very close relationship with Canada. And here is Keir Starmer trying to keep the Americans on board, but potentially with this complication now with Canada and with Europe, both Canada and Europe being in a much more hostile relationship with the US right now than we are. Is his position sustainable? I know we've debated this almost every week, but the more you look at it, the more you think, blimey, he is walking a tightrope here, and pretty soon there's surely a danger he's going to fall off.
Well, I do think Canada and the UK are very different countries, and I don't think that we should just say because of the success of the Liberals in Canada, therefore Labour, would have to change the way it behaves. I certainly know people in the Labour Party do not think that that would be the lesson that you would learn from this, because the way we feel about the US is different to the way Canada feels about the US. For example, that polling I mentioned, in which, quite a small minority of Canadians think the US is now a force for good. We're actually quite low on that list as well, but quite a long way above Canada. Although Donald Trump is not that popular in the UK, the US relationship is still seen as really, really key. Another bit of polling that we mentioned last week, extraordinary turnaround in the number of people in this country who now see the US as a threat, but still slightly more want to see the US as an ally and an important one. And then there's that whole conversation behind closed doors that none of us will ever have, Tom, unless you become prime minister, where you start to understand about the intelligence links and the economic links that make it very difficult to stand up to the US. All that said, I do think it raises a question, and we'll be giving them pause for thought in Downing Street, which is perhaps there is something to be said for standing up to Donald Trump when you feel the time is right to do so. I mean, I think they would say that it's not all been just ingratiating, that they have tried to take a stand on some issues, but obviously the optics of it, have felt. I don't know, is Poodle, maybe this is not a Poodle moment, but not far off. Okay. Some of the optics of it have felt that way.
Okay. Robert, I'm very pleased to say, has joined us. If you're watching, you can see. If you're not, he's joined us from West London. We're just talking Mark Carney, Robert, and what, in essence, is your feeling about the impact on us of Mark Carney's victory?
I think the most important thing to say about Mark Carney, and I think this is probably implicit in what I didn't hear all of what Anushka had to say, but I think it's probably implicit in what she had to say, is obviously Mark Carney's position vis-a-vis Trump is very different from Keir Starmer's, in that he's got very little to lose in standing up much more explicitly to Trump than Starmer has, in the sense that Trump has been so aggressive in terms of what he said about Canada, wanting, basically trying to encourage Canada to become America's, well, more than actually encourage, trying to essentially force Canada to become America's 51st state. The incredibly aggressive things he said about Carney's predecessor, Trudeau. Also, there's no question that one of the reasons Carney won is because his own rhetoric about what Trump is doing obviously resonated with Canadians, and therefore he's already, in a sense, set out his stall as the anti-Trump. So, he is now the sort of, for millions of people across the world who can't stand what Trump's doing, he is, now their champion, and he can afford to, both in terms of what Canada does, but in trying to set an agenda for the world, he can afford to take a much more explicitly aggressive line vis-a-vis America. And in particular, one of the things I've actually been arguing would be rational in an economic sense for, essentially all countries outside of the US to do, is to form it's a phrase I've been using for weeks now, which is this, a coalition of the economically willing. And that would be either a less formal or formal, alliance between UK, the EU, South Korea, Japan, even possibly, China, that is, suffering very significant damage as a result of Trump's tariffs. And essentially, these like-minded countries would bring down the cost of trading between each other, either reducing tariffs between each other, reducing what are known as non-tariff barriers, other frictions that limit trade. And it seems to me that Carney can, and as I understand it, has been thinking about doing this, could essentially be the cheerleader, the flag waver, the leader of this coalition of the economically willing, as a sort of version analogous to the way that Starmer and Macron have set themselves up as the sort of leaders of the coalition of the willing when it comes to being the peacekeeping force, if there's ever a peace between Ukraine and Moscow. So I do think that Carney can play a very significant role, not just as leader of his own country, but actually a sort of symbolically important role internationally.